Welcome to the Chopin channel. I'm Roberto Poli. My previous video focused on the symbol that in English we call the hairpin. It acquired this name because of its obvious resemblance to a hairpin. Of course, it's not its official designation, but it's much more convenient than crescendo and diminuendo forks. For one, because the word hairpin is shorter, but more importantly, as we saw in the previous video, because hairpins are not dynamic markings, or at least not exclusively so. Calling them crescendo and diminuendo forks would simply reinforce and perpetuate that assumption. We discussed how hairpins are frequently encountered in contexts involving agogic inflection, slight modifications of pulse and timing that shape the musical discourse. Their appearance coincides with a period in which composers increasingly felt the need to supplement the musical text with interpretive markings, allowing performers to come closer to what they might have thought to be the ideal interpretation of a work. If we look at the music written in the early 18th century, we find that its notation generally consists of little more than the notes themselves. Beginning in the 1750s, dynamic indications started to appear systematically. Over the following decades, what we now call articulatory markings, slurs, staccato dots, and related signs, became increasingly common. By the late 1770s, composers were employing markings such as sforzando and a wider range of dynamic nuances. Then, during the 1780s, we begin to encounter terms such as morendo and perdendosi, descriptive indications intended to represent a gradual relaxation of tempo, in other words, a rallentando or a ritardando. It is also during this decade that hairpins first begin to appear. By the 1830s, hairpins had become a firmly established feature of musical notation. The earliest keyboard work I have been able to locate that contains hairpins is the first edition of Franz Joseph Haydn's Sonata in D major, Hoboken 42, published in 1784. We have then to wait until 1789 to find another keyboard work by Haydn in which a hairpin appears, the Sonata in C major, Hoboken 48. Let's examine the three instances found in the first movement of the Sonata in C major, marked Adagio. The first hairpin I'd like to look at appears with the return of the A section. Based on the information I shared in my previous video, this hairpin seems to suggest a broadening of tempo as we approach the reappearance of the opening theme. A second hairpin occurs shortly afterward, perhaps indicating a subtle agogic inflection within the melodic line. We will return to this particular example later because it will play an important role in our discussion. The third hairpin, chronologically the first encountered in the movement, is placed above a group of unaccompanied 16th notes. This example, too, will become central to our analysis. I don't think it's a coincidence that these markings appear predominantly in slow movements. If hairpins are indeed associated with agogic inflection, lingering on particular notes, slight rallentandos, or other forms of expressive flexibility within a phrase, then their frequent appearance in lyrical and melodic contexts makes good sense. As for where Haydn encountered the marking, I don't really know. Yet, his output suggests that someone must have introduced him to it toward the end of his years at Esterházy, where he served Prince Nikolaus until the prince's death in 1790. This was not the first attempt to devise symbols capable of communicating agogic freedom. In his Klavierschule of 1789, the same year Haydn composed the Sonata in C major, Daniel Gottlob Türk introduced markings intended precisely for that purpose. He believed that his system would establish a precedent for future musical notation. We know, of course, that this prediction did not come to pass. Nevertheless, his efforts demonstrate that musicians of the period were actively searching for ways to notate expressive flexibility. It seems reasonable to assume that once Haydn began using hairpins, other composers were beginning to adopt them as well. We see Beethoven employing them regularly in some of his early works, initially with some restraint, but increasingly as his style developed. By the time Chopin began publishing his music, hairpins had become an intrinsic component of the musical text. This, then, is a broad outline of how hairpins entered the notational vocabulary, even if their precise origin remains somewhat mysterious. What I find particularly fascinating is the process by which a symbol becomes universal. At some point, a marking that was once unfamiliar begins appearing with such frequency that it becomes part of the common language shared by composers, performers, publishers, and readers. How exactly that happened in the case of the hairpin remains unclear. Personal contact, imitation, teaching, publishing networks, and perhaps a good deal of word of mouth likely all played a role. In my previous video, I mentioned that there are two other important aspects of hairpins beyond their agogic significance. In this second video, I would like to focus on just one of them. As I was preparing the material, I realized that covering both would require far more time than I initially anticipated, so there will be a separate video devoted to the third remaining aspect. Both meanings are extremely important, but the phenomenon I'd like to focus on today is a gradual continuation of the ideas introduced in the first video. We mentioned several cases of redundancies and contradictions, moments in which a hairpin intended as a dynamic marking, for example, appears either as a reiteration of the increase or decrease in volume requested, an opening hairpin accompanying a crescendo, or a closing hairpin accompanying a diminuendo or decrescendo, or as an opposition to the dynamic prescribed, a closing hairpin accompanying or following a crescendo, or a diminuendo followed or accompanied by an opening hairpin. But what if hairpins appear alongside other hairpins, either as redundancies or contradictions? Consider, for example, this passage from Chopin's second Ballade. If we were to follow the agogic interpretation exclusively, we would arrive at a rather curious conclusion. One hand would have to begin more slowly than the other, while in turn the other hand would end more slowly. It's difficult to imagine how such an effect could even be realized in performance. Is one of the two hairpins perhaps telling us something different? The possible meaning occurred to me many years ago while studying the first of Chopin's Mazurkas, opus 59. At the beginning of the second page, two closing hairpins appear, one in the middle of the system and one under the left hand. My first reaction was, why the redundancy? If both markings indicate the same agogic inflection, then one hairpin would seem sufficient. I can linger slightly at the beginning of the measure and then return to tempo. That makes perfect musical sense. But why would Chopin need two hairpins to tell me the same thing? If I had learned anything from the agogic role of hairpins, it was that the presence of a double hairpin must have served two different purposes, one for each hairpin. In this particular passage, the left hand emerges with the return of the main theme, while the dotted figures come to an end. Was the hairpin under the left hand suggesting not an additional agogic inflection, but the melodic significance of the left hand line? In other words, voicing. Once I began to look for this possibility, I noticed other examples where a hairpin appears under the left hand alone. One such case occurs at the opening of the Chopin Ballade in F minor, opus 52, where Chopin assigns, just as he had done 3 years earlier in the second ballade, 2 hairpins, one for each hand, but in opposite directions. What these passages seem to share is that the left hand, accompanied by a hairpin, carries a melodic idea that might otherwise go unnoticed. This is perhaps especially true in the 2 ballades, where the thematic significance of the left hand may not be immediately apparent. Just to be clear about what is happening, let's examine each of these 3 passages individually. In the second ballade, the closing hairpin in the middle of the system suggests that we should linger at the beginning of the measure and gradually return to tempo by its end. The opening hairpin in the following measure invites the opposite gesture, beginning in tempo and broadening as the measure unfolds. This pattern recurs each time the material returns. The hairpin under the left hand, however, serves a different function. The left hand can easily be perceived as a simple bass line or accompaniment rather than as a thematic voice deserving special attention, an element that might otherwise remain concealed within the texture. Yet, it's precisely this hidden melodic strand that should be heard distinctly above the right hand's descending arpeggiated figuration. In the following measure, no hairpin appears under the left hand because the melodic line is no longer present and both hands contribute to harmonic, rhythmic, and textural material. The marking returns only when the melody reappears in the bass. So the appearance and disappearance of the left hand hairpin seems to follow the melodic function of the voice rather than any agogic consideration. The marking is present when the left hand carries thematic material and absent when it does not. A similar situation can be observed at the opening of the fourth ballade. The G octave in the right hand may be understood as the beginning of a melodic line worthy of particular attention. In fact, the G does eventually emerge as the principal note of the main melody in the second half of the following measure. At the same time, the left hand introduces a melodic strand that is equally important to the polyphonic structure. It's only 5 notes long, but it spiritually connects to the alto voice and the lower note of the right hand octave, eventually continuing in the tenor register. The hairpin under the left hand seems to draw attention to this less obvious voice, which might otherwise recede into the background as the ear follows the more conspicuous material above. By contrast, the opening and closing hairpins above the right hand appear to suggest an agogic inflection, broadening towards the final G and then returning to tempo afterward. In this passage, therefore, the 2 sets of hairpins seem to operate independently, those in the right hand shaping time, and the one in the left hand highlighting a melodic strand within the texture. In the Mazurka in A minor, opus 59, number 1, we encounter an overlap of voices, with the left hand entering against a melodic line that is already in motion. It signals that the left hand has assumed a melodic role and must be voiced accordingly if it is to be heard clearly. In fact, the left hand, somewhat unexpectedly, takes over the principal theme while the right hand continues the dotted rhythm figure that had dominated the preceding episode. In this context, the left-hand hairpin functions almost like a large visual accent, drawing the performer's attention to the thematic material hidden within the texture, some sort of voice me. And I think it's significant that the hairpin comes to an end precisely when the melody is taken over and continued by the right hand. Admittedly, some of these melodic strands may seem obvious to us today, particularly the one in the Mazurka. What we should remember, however, is that these markings appeared at a time when hairpins were still relatively new elements of musical notation, and composers may have felt not only eager to use them systematically, but also compelled to employ them to direct the performer's attention to a particular musical event. If the marking is available, why not use it? This may not have been the only reason, though. The market for printed piano music consisted largely of amateur musicians, particularly members of the upper middle classes and aristocracy, many of whom were untrained. When considering why composers gradually introduced more and more notation into their scores, we can assume that part of the motivation was the desire to communicate a musical idea as clearly as possible, bringing the performer closer to the conception that gave rise to the work. On a more practical level, however, amateur musicians often required a degree of guidance. Some markings may therefore have functioned as visual aids, drawing attention to features of the musical texture that might otherwise be overlooked. Seen from this perspective, a hairpin placed under a melodic strand in the left hand is not fundamentally different from a piano teacher circling a group of notes or each individual note to show where the melody is, or outlining it with a highlighter. It alerts the performer to the presence of a significant voice and encourages it to be projected appropriately. The use of hairpins to highlight voices that might not be immediately obvious doesn't begin with Chopin, but sometime in the early 19th century. Beethoven used sets of opening and closing hairpins to show the voicing of the bass line at the end of the first movement of the sonata in C sharp minor, opus 27, number 2, the Moonlight, for example. In Variation 20 of the Diabelli Variations, opus 120, published in 1823, Beethoven seems explicitly concerned with the outlining of a contrapuntal passage. The bass at the opening does not need to be marked as the theme because it appears alone. When the right hand enters, the very fact that a new voice has joined naturally draws attention to it. But when the bass takes over again, three voices have been in motion for several beats, then joined by a fourth. And Beethoven signals that it is now the bass's turn to come to the foreground. Likewise, the next melodic strand, appearing in the soprano, requires emphasis, since the performer might otherwise overlook the imitation and treat the right hand merely as harmonic accompaniment. This is an extraordinary example that, surprisingly, many pianists fail to notice or highlight in their performances of the piece. For some time, I wondered why this detail escaped the attention of even the most eminent performers. While it is certainly possible that some may simply overlook the entrances of the thematic motif, I suspected that there might be a more practical explanation. As I consulted various editions in an effort to understand the issue, I discovered that the problem stems from later editorial traditions that obscure Beethoven's intentions. In these editions, the right hand part is no longer notated on the lower staff as we see in the original edition, but is instead transferred to the upper staff. In addition, the set of hairpins to show the voicing of the bass is repositioned, for no good reason, to the middle of the system, creating the impression that the markings apply to both hands rather than exclusively to the left hand. The second set of hairpins remains in its original position, but the transferring of the right hand to the upper staff produces the same misleading effect. We can then see how this becomes, in part, an issue of placement. A hairpin may change meaning as soon as it is displaced, even by the smallest margin. If its closeness to, for instance, a tenor line indicates that the tenor voice should be brought to the fore against other voices within the left hand, moving it slightly higher within the system may instead alter its function, suggesting perhaps an agogic inflection that applies to both hands instead of voicing for the left hand. The case of the hairpins in Beethoven's Diabelli variations serves as a reminder that even authoritative editions are not always authoritative. Maybe it would be fairer to say that the sources used by these editions are not always consulted critically. This is not to suggest that pianists should approach every printed text with suspicion, yet perhaps it is our responsibility to consult original sources whenever available, especially autographed manuscripts. It is there, closer to the composer's hand, that we may find answers to at least some of the symbols and markings that continue to puzzle performers and scholars alike. In the three examples I offered, the Ballades 2 and 4 and the Mazurka from Opus 59, the melodic relevance is in the left hand. But what about other voices that are not so obviously isolated? Say, an alto line that may at first glance look secondary, but that for a composer carries particular significance. For example, this hairpin in the Ballade in G minor Opus 23. It seems to show that what Chopin wanted to hear in this transition is the voicing of the alto line, a descending chromatic motif that we find elsewhere in the piece. In the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the only hairpins present, apart from the instance at the end of the movement mentioned earlier, are the opening and closing hairpins indicating the voicing of short melodic strands, which occur both at the top and the bottom of the right-hand triplets. Two more sets of hairpins are found in the second thematic area, where the left hand moves melodically in octaves against the regular triplets in the right hand. Here are a couple of examples in which single hairpins appear to indicate voicing, this time in contrapuntal contexts. Consider the highly contrapuntal exchange as the development section of the first movement of Chopin's Sonata in B minor, Opus 58, begins. Each entrance of the thematic fragment is marked by a short hairpin. These hairpins do not suggest that the notes they affect should simply be played louder in the moment, as they are often interpreted. Rather, Each hairpin signals the opening of a significant melodic strand that should be brought to the foreground and voiced accordingly. It's as though a light were switched on for the first note of the line, inviting the performer to follow and illuminate its continuation. Then another light appears, and another, and then another, tracing the succession of voices as they emerge from the texture. The question then is not merely how prominently the melodic strand should be projected in order to be heard, but also how much of the surrounding voices must recede to allow it to speak clearly. A similar use of hairpins can be found in a late work by Johannes Brahms, the Intermezzo in E-flat minor, opus 118, number 6. Here, short hairpins mark successive entrances of the principal melodic motif as it passes imitatively from one voice to another, helping to clarify the contrapuntal dialogue and indicating which strand should be brought to the foreground each time. I could continue with examples all day, really, but we'll have to end this video here. As we have seen, hairpins, whether short or long, can serve different functions, and multiple functions may coexist within the same passage. If we interpret them exclusively as dynamic markings, their meaning becomes unnecessarily restricted. But if we also consider their agogic implications, as well as their potential role in indicating voicing, the prominence of one voice over others, then the presence of several hairpins within a single passage can eliminate interpretive possibilities that might otherwise remain hidden under the surface of the text. Look at the pieces you are playing currently and see whether you find any evidence of left-hand voicing outlined by hairpins. Drop a comment with your findings, and like and subscribe, of course, if you feel like it. In my next video, I will turn to what I consider the third function of hairpins, a function that is not only fascinating in its own right, but also revealing of historical practices that have largely escaped modern awareness. I hope you'll join me next time.